interest of time, I want okay, in the interest of time, I want to get started here. So I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping before we start. We still have some SAC members who do not have their who have not renamed their screen. If you could go ahead and do that, that'd be fantastic. So Mike Parker is here with me today, co-chairing. Thanks, Mike. I'll be hopping off here shortly. I took a 6-day family vacation, didn't check any emails during that time, and everyone knows what happens when people do that. So I have a lot of work stuff I need to catch up on. Today, we are joined by Chief Wendy Jones from Whatcom County Jail. Chief Jones has been kind enough to come today and kind of explain some programming and some things that are happening at the jail. So I really appreciate, Chief, you coming today. We all are also joined by Prosecutor Ryan Anderson. And Mr. Anderson, I asked him to come today to talk about what prosecution looks like on misdemeanor crimes. So things that are happening in muni court, what happens to those defendants if they are found guilty of their crimes, what happens to them, and how are those cases resolved? And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over. Mike, are you good to go?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely good to go. And I'm sure you all saw the agenda. This is key for you guys to be able to ask questions. And so we really want that. Obviously, we'll let our presenters kind of make their presentations, but please ask your questions. This forum and the guest presenters are really here for you all to deepen that understanding. So again, we just really encourage your active participation, and thanks everybody for being here, and especially our presenters.
Okay, with that, I'm going to sign off. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.
Good afternoon,
Chief Jones, if you are ready, we are ready for you, and very appreciative of your being here.
I appreciate the opportunity. I worked with Kathy, and she's volunteered to be my audio assistant because I'm of a generation that isn't as digitally savvy as I would like to be. So just a couple of things, talking a little bit about some of the issues that we're running into, and then spending more time talking about the programs that we offer and the connections we have with the community is really what I'm focusing on. And the first is just kind of an overview and why I'm here. About 45% of the offender population carries a diagnosis of serious mental illness. Now, I know a lot of you have been involved in various different committees, have life experience, may experience some of this professionally, but a lot of people don't realize that the percentage of mentally ill offenders in the jail is as high as it is. Now, it's bumped up to 58%, dropped a little bit, because we've been able to get some cases resolved and folks have actually been transferred to Western State Hospital. Between 65 and 80% of the offenders have some type of substance abuse or substance use issues that oftentimes lead them to come to the jail. In addition to those two, which are major factors for our population, there are some additional factors which complicate all of the above because oftentimes they overlap. And if Kathy, we can go to the next one, that would be great. Oh, wonderful, I can do that. Cool. The first one is we get individuals with cognitive disabilities, and that's not always obvious when they first come into the facility. That can be that we have people on very much different spectrums. It's not uncommon for us to have folks who are on the autism spectrum. And the other large group that we get that with some cognitive issues is the fetal alcohol spectrum, because a lot of them are coming from moms who were drinking or using when they were pregnant, and their brains don't work quite the same as other folks. And it's not always obvious at first, especially if they're also using some sort of substances in the community. We have individuals come in with underlying health issues, and those aren't always early recognized unless the offender tells us, and oftentimes they do not. One of the big things we see are if people are coming in, they've got underlying issues like diabetes, and so they're struggling with blood sugar control, which can really change how they're behaving. And if they're getting most of their calories from alcohol, that doesn't work very well. A relative of that is things that are undiagnosed and untreated medical problems. And in fact, we had one come in this past week, or excuse me, the end of last week, that presented as somebody with very acute mental health issues. And it turned out that was not in fact what was going on. We were lucky in the fact our medical staff and the corrections deputies recognized that, and we were able to redirect her to the hospital. You've got folks who come in and know that they have some issues, but are completely not interested in cooperating with any kind of treatment. Some of that can be linked to some stigma and beliefs around mental illness or substance abuse. One of the things that over my 40 years I've found consistently is a lot of people don't want to admit that they have any kind of what would be considered a mental illness. The response we'll get frequently is, I'm not crazy. And we're saying, nobody's saying you're crazy, but we have people here who have schizophrenia. We have people here who have diabetes and heart disease. You might fit one or all of those. Denial is tied into that whole issue about stigma, and it's something we run into a lot. Probably the most significant group of things that override and interlinked with diagnoses are, and Kathy, maybe, no, I guess you're gonna have to do it. If you can move me to the next one. I'm not sure how many of you folks have been introduced to the idea of what are called criminogenic risk factors. Some people are aware of them and some people are not. Increasingly, research is demonstrating that criminogenic theory, thinking and behavior differentiates people who commit crime from those who do not, independent of mental illness. And that when you're looking at incarcerated populations, what you find is individuals with mental illness are frequently mentally ill and criminogenic, and both need to be addressed. Because one of the things that I've finally picked up after the years is a lot of folks feel that if we identify somebody in our system who is bipolar or schizophrenic, and medications are given to them and they're stabilized in that way, that will discontinue their involvement with the criminal justice system. And increasing research is coming out that said that's not true, that there are a very large percentage of our offender population that have those criminogenic risk factors. We'll talk about those in just a second. Also, who may have mental illness. So medication is prescribed to deal with a bipolar disorder, for example. That doesn't address the underlying criminogenic issues which overlay the top and intersect with the behavior that you're seeing on the street. And Kathy, if we can go to that next slide, please.
May I ask a question? I'm sorry. Is this an
Sure.
appropriate time? Thanks, Wendy. Hi. Can you share the studies that you're referring to?
I'll put together a list. I've got the source material in a file folder sitting on my desk. So I'll
Thank
put
you.
something together and get it to Kathy and ask her if she can forward it out to folks.
Thank you.
Sure. Criminogenic risk factors are the ones you see listed here. Basically things like antisocial behavior, people who are diagnosed with an antisocial personality, antisocial thinking, antisocial associates. You see a trend there. Those tend to all kind of group together. Oftentimes folks come from pretty dysfunctional families. They're engaged in substance abuse. They're underemployed or unemployed. Generally, you don't have very high educational attainment, even though a lot of our folks are actually fairly bright. They just didn't conform really well to school rules, and so they drop out. Leisure and activities and recreation tend to be with other people who think the way they do. If you want to think of somebody as a difference between somebody who was in custody simply because of a mental illness and somebody who got involved with the criminal justice system that probably had some mental health issues, but very much was much more a profile of this criminogenic risk factors, you can look at the difference between the gentleman who they call the Son of Sam, who was the guy who was shooting people over in New York. He truly believed, and to everything that I'm aware of, still believes that there was a demon talking to him through his neighbor's dog and compelling him to perform those behaviors. On the other hand, you get people like Tim McVeigh, who blew up the building, the federal building down in Oklahoma, or Ted Bundy. They don't diagnose as seriously mentally ill the way we're talking about. They very much diagnose as antisocial personalities. They don't conform very well to rules. They believe things that I would suspect very few people who are here today would agree with. They think that as long as they think it's okay, it's fine. They don't have to conform to the rules of society. They're very much the folks that I'm sure Chief Ulmer and I know Under Sheriff Chadwick can tell you that law enforcement are dealing with on a daily basis. They also make really good used car salesmen, shysters, or some lawyers, sorry, Maya, and some politicians, because that sense of right and wrong and how that comes across isn't the same one that is generally accepted as how we want people to behave. So if you take the criminogenic factors and you mix it with, say, somebody who's using alcohol and somebody who is in a manic phase in their life, you've got an individual who's pretty out of control. Those are not the kind of individuals that get admitted to One Central. They're not the kind of people that can be stabilized at the stabilization center, because at that point, they're too out of control and too dangerous to society to try to use those types of settings in order to get them back under control. Kathy, if you could pop to the next one, please. I promise you there are only like 7 slides, so it won't be too much longer. I wanted to give you an idea of the behavioral health programs and the intersections we have with community programs in the jail currently. We have 2 full-time mental health professional positions. Right now, our contractor that operates through the health department actually is still short 1, but they have some hope that we'll have the second one here shortly. We have a full-time reentry specialist. We have a full-time or a part-time psychiatric ARMP who performs additional evaluations. I'm not sure where that came from. Additional evaluations and prescribes the medication. The Corrections Bureau has started an MOUD program, which stands for Medication for Opioid Use Disorder. We had a small one for a number of years. We got a new practitioner as of January. And so what has happened is that program has skyrocketed. Since 1st of January of this year, we've continued people on an opioid substitution program, 83 of them that were on programs in the community. The thing that is most astounding to me is that we have had 453 people started who had not reached out to the community at all, as far as getting opioid substitution medication to try and help them go into recovery. So that's 453 who weren't involved with any of the programs in the community that got started while they were in jail. We also work with DVSAS. They come in and do group meetings. They're starting to ramp back up again. Like with most of you, they were affected by COVID and the ability to come into the jail. They also provide as our third-party reporters. So if an offender feels that they have been sexually assaulted or sexually harassed by inmates or potentially staff, or they may have experienced something prior to coming in custody, there's a toll-free number that there's no charge on our phone system that they can report that to DVSAS. We also have a very good relationship with the designated crisis responders for involuntary detention for mental health issues, and we work with them on a regular basis. The other agencies that we deal with include voluntary community substance abuse programs like AA and NA. 2 of the reasons we've found those groups are very useful is because they can meet people where they're at the next morning after they've been arrested, if it's around drugs or alcohol. All of the folks who participate in those programs are people who've gone through it themselves. There's a variety of different faith-based supports that will come in if somebody reaches out or asks us to reach out. We also work with a wide variety of state and local agencies, DCFS and Department of Social and Health Services, Western State Hospital, Lake Whatcom and their PACT program, Compass Health. Lifeline Connections are in fact the contractors that the health department has to provide the mental health professionals, the reentry specialist, and our prescriber. Bridget Collins is a connection because a lot of our folks have kids And one of the good things for us is that our prior reentry specialist is now case manager up at Bridget Collins. We work with the Opportunity Council for housing, the Lummi Nation, because we have some of their folks here in our facility, Northwest Youth Services, the GRACE program, and now LEAD. We've expanded that capability a little bit with one of my deputies who has been assigned to the classification section of the jail, who is very good at reaching out to the community providers. We can go to the next one, Kathy. I know this is quick, but what I'm hoping out of this conversation that we're going to be having is that the downtown jail and the work center can be seen as a point of engagement, not just incarceration. The number of people who come in here, apparently very out of control, creating issues in the community which bring law enforcement to their attention. The number of those individuals who are evaluated and diagnosed and helped while they're here is actually pretty outstanding. I cannot count the number of parents or spouses or siblings I've talked to for whom this is a new idea, that they may have a member of their family is having these type of issues and that we can help them with that. The last thing I want to mention, and then I'll throw it open to questions, is that the programs that the community is developing and will continue to develop are terrific. They have a huge impact on some segments of the population. My concern is that although programs like GRACE, which I support 100%, they're able to pull some people out of that criminal justice system wheel. But if you'll look, and this is the last slide I put together, the blue bars are the jail population. Where you see that dip in 2020 and 2021 was suppressed because of a combination of COVID and booking restrictions. The line you're seeing was the number of enrollment in GRACE. Now, please don't pay attention to the last part of it. I included the jail population for 2022 year to date as of the end of January, because I want people to understand we're going back up again, and that's creating its own new set of problems. But you can see that the jail population is very reactive to things that happen in the community as far as things like COVID. But right now, what you're looking at is the numbers back in 2018, 2019, we really didn't have booking restrictions. And now what we're doing is impeding the ability of law enforcement to bring people into custody because I simply don't have the beds to place them. And especially with the specialty populations that we have. GRACE has done great, and they've taken some folks out of the jail and kept them out of the jail for years. And for that, I applaud them 100%. But they cannot manage all of the folks who fill the criteria that I just got done kind of sharing with you. So I'm going to leave it at that because, as many of you know, once I start talking, sometimes I have to remember to stop. So I'm going to open it to questions. I see Mr. Lilliquist, you had one?
Yeah, first of all, can you hear me?
Yes, can you?
Okay,
hear me?
good,
Yeah.
because I have funny headphones on. You gave a lot of statistics, but unfortunately, I need to know kind of how they overlap with each other. You say 45% have serious mental illness, and some unnumbered percentage has cognitive issues. Are those, and they overlap a little bit, you said? Or do they overlap a lot? Same thing with medical conditions, and especially those with mental illness and criminogenic thinking and behavior. For example, if almost everyone who's mentally ill also has criminogenic behavior, we sort of have one problem with two aspects. If, however, you have a small overlap, then you have two problems that sometimes overlap, right? And I don't know if you add all those percentages together, that 90% of the jail population has at least one of those categories of disadvantages, right? So I need the overlap, and do you have that overlap? Can you get us that Venn diagram of all those conditions?
Maybe. I can certainly work on it and get it to Kathy and ask her to move it out to all of the members of both SAC and the task force. The issue is that the information that, or the research that's being done for that overlap between mental illness and criminogenic behavior is probably the last 5 to 8 years. But I can pull those studies up and certainly give you that information. The cognitive is something that that's picked up by our nursing staff and the corrections deputies, we don't have the ability here, I don't have the resources here to sit down and give everybody a test to kind of measure where that's at. What happens is quite quickly you see what is normative behavior for an offender population is not necessarily normative behavior for any of you or the general public. One of the other things I do want to point out is that the sheer number of people who would have a serious mental illness in the United States is actually quite high. The number of people who are identified in a jail or prison system is much smaller. But that population, the folks who are mentally ill who wind up in custody frequently, and they're talking, one of the studies said as much as 60% of the people who are identified as having a serious mental illness also test out to showing criminogenic risk factors. There are people that are just have a mental illness, don't have that criminogenic issue. They get resolved in different ways. Oftentimes they don't stay in custody nearly as long. They may be some of those folks that ultimately wind up with a not guilty plea and going to state hospital or other community providers. It's relatively new research, because for years and years, including when I started, it was if we get people stabilized on psychotropic medications, they'll be fine. But then what started happening is we realized that they were not, that the obvious and florid symptoms of the psychiatric disorder had been moderated or gone away, but the behavior that was oftentimes bringing them to the attention of law enforcement hadn't changed in any major way. So we'll have folks that come here, we get them restarted or started on psych meds, and the symptoms associated with that, delusions, romantic behavior, hallucinations, are moderated or go away, but acting out while they're here does not. And so then,
Wendy,
I'm sorry.
sorry for interrupting, but here's where I'm going with this.
Okay.
What you've done is created a picture of complexity, but I'm looking for clarity.
Okay.
And I would have clarity if I understood those Venn diagrams, those overlaps. Our task is to come up with recommendations on facilities and programs. And to do that, we kind of have to know the magnitude of the people who fit into certain need categories and understand those percentages. If it turns out that 90% of the people in the jail who have a serious mental illness and cognitive issues also have criminogenic thinking and behavior, then our focus really should be on how do we deal with criminogenic thinking and behavior so we don't get reoffenses. If, on the other hand, you have a case where a large percentage of people who have cognitive disabilities and mental illness don't have criminogenic behavior, then what we have is a bunch of people who are in jail for the wrong reasons, non-criminogenic reasons. And then we have a different program. So we really need to know the degree of overlap to understand what programs and what facilities will be needed.
I will do my best to pull that together to you, feed
Thank
it
you.
back through Kathy and get it to everybody. I don't know I'm going to be able to quantify. The data I'll probably be able to pull is going to be from national studies. We don't have the ability to do cognitive assessments on everybody who comes through this jail.
Sure,
So
but if we had
that's-
estimates like 1/4 of the people, right, then we can scale a program and staffing to suit.
Reality is that we don't have the resources to do that here. So I'm not going to be able to give you that specific to Whatcom County, but jails are pretty similar throughout the country. So yes, I can definitely do the research to find nationwide what we're finding and get that to you. And then if that puts us in the right direction, you can let me know some more specific questions based on that.
Right, Wendy, I'm going to help you referee. I think Stephen was next.
Wendy, thank you for this information. It was very helpful. I do agree with Michael that it doesn't get us the kind of clarity we might ultimately need. I'm wondering if you do any screening for criminogenic factors, if such tools exist out in the field. That's my first question.
Yes, there are screening tools. They are standard psych exams, basically, that are picking up on individuals who would be symptomatic of antisocial personality disorder. a great truth in the corrections facility, corrections profession is that except for people who are seriously mentally ill, probably, I want to say 80% of the offenders, especially once they get to prison, would classify out as having some of those criminogenic behaviors, and we just consider them offenders. There's behaviors that are accepted as normative in a corrections facility that are not in the community. And so for purposes of most corrections populations, they're just assumed to be that they're acting that way because they're offenders. It's only as research has been coming forward and saying, no, there's these clusters of behavior we're seeing with offenders, which are very difficult to treat. We're talking about multi-year psychotherapy in order to get them to understand that what they're doing is not what the rest of society is doing. And the behaviors that are resulting are winding them up in jail. And so that's part of it. It's one of the reasons that my deputies could probably give you a list of people that if I told them this is what the kind of behavior we were looking for, they could find that real quickly. They wouldn't necessarily know. None of us are psychologists to be able to sit somebody down and have them do the testing to find out where that is. So that's why I'm having to depend on national studies.
So I guess I have a couple of requests of you coming out of this.
Sure.
Number one, it would be helpful to have even an estimated number of how many people demonstrate criminogenic risk factors. I suspect that's a much bigger problem than the cognitive impairments.
It
But
is.
yeah. Number two, your list of research articles would be very helpful. Number three, I don't see how the SAC can make recommendations that would guide effective investments in what we're talking about here without some handle on that. And I wonder if you could, again, ballpark, give us a cost estimate of the resources you would need to somehow, at least in a minimal way, identify, if not intervene on criminogenic risk factors. Because if we don't do anything about that, I think we're going to be throwing dollars down the drain in a lot of cases.
Let me see what I can do.
Thank you.
I'm going to have to do a little bit of investigation for that, but
Right. Next up, Arlene, please, and then Erica.
Yeah, this is a bit of a follow-up on Michael's comments, and that's that in order to evaluate the effectiveness of programs, you have to have the right proportion of staff to residents. And so if we look at what you just said to us, you've got 2.5 staff to 265 individuals, which just without being an absolute expert on this topic would tell me that it's insufficient staff. So I wonder if you have an idea of how many staff would be appropriate or adequate.
actually Perry, Mallory, and Jackie Mitchell with the health department put together some of that. I think that you'll be getting that on the meeting on the 14th. And it would certainly at least double. But the other issue is that even if I had twice as many MHPs, we have no space for them to do what they need to do. That in this facility, we don't have conference rooms or one-on-one counseling rooms, and they certainly can't have that kind of interaction with offenders through the chow hatch at the housing unit. So that's another, it's not just the number of people, it's also the amount of space and resources we have in this facility to be able to conduct that kind of either interview and evaluation or treatment. Because one of the other things is average stay in this jail, even though it's much higher than it should be, is only 20 days. And especially when you're dealing with the criminogenic tendencies, that can take years before somebody goes, oh, wait a minute, maybe that isn't okay behavior.
So that actually is sort of you're talking a little bit about my second question, which is that when you reported to us at an earlier time to the Incarceration Reduction Task Force, you spoke about the fact that there were no rooms to meet in. And that was how you said it, no rooms. And so now when you're talking about these programs that are in operation, are there suddenly rooms?
No.
So
What happens
how
is
are
that
they
people-
meeting? How is the NA or AA meeting?
Frequently, those folks will come in very odd hours. The one room that we have that would be appropriate for a group setting basically is taken up by the court system Monday through Friday during business hours. So these are groups of individuals who are coming in the evening, on weekends, voluntary primarily, to come and work with these offenders. That if they can do it one-on-one, we can kind of tuck them into a few spaces, but the combination of wanting it private, but still having it secure, limits it to basically 2 spots that I've got in the jail. That's just one-on-one. It doesn't have enough space for group. But it's the fact that the folks who are coming to provide those services are doing it because they're very invested in the offender population and are willing to do it off hours and on the weekends. So.
All right, next up is Erica.
Thanks. I'll be quick, Mike. I know there's a long line of hands. And Wendy, you said this, but I just want to double down that, like, I think it's a sort of a spurious assumption to assume that criminogenic behavior equals mental illness and mental illness equals criminogenic behavior. And I see you saying, no, I know you didn't say that, but people with mental illness are more likely to be a victim of a crime than a perpetrator of a crime. And I just want to make sure that we're not thinking that that working through the mental illness issues of people in our community is the silver bullet to reduce the jail population. Because and this is a problem with, you know, the national debate around these mass shootings. Many of the perpetrators of mass shootings would not be considered to have a serious mental illness. They have antisocial behaviors and behaviors of a chip on their shoulder and entitlement, right? Which is more on the antisocial side. So I want to make sure that we're really careful about not pairing those too closely together to assume that they're one and the same.
Thank you, Erica. You said it.
Say that, Wendy, but I just want to double down on it.
You were much more eloquent about it than I was. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Brell, I think you're up next.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sort of building on that, but maybe a totally different take on it is that, yeah, I'm really curious to learn more about criminogenic risk factors and learning about that research. Just on first glance of the risk factors that you named, what pops out to me is that many of them are symptomatic of poverty and trauma. And so if we are going to be looking at, as Michael said, about programs that will treat the risk factors, to me, those 2 places would be a great place to start. And also, as far as like not conflating things, I feel like it's important as well to not conflate psychopathy with these like criminogenic risk factors, because like while there might be someone that is psychopathic, which is incredibly hard to treat, right? That those 2 terms aren't synonymous. So like using some examples of people that are serial killers may not be like, you know, it seems like there's a real spectrum there, right, of these risk factors and the difficulty of treatment. So that's my only comment. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Brell. Harriet, I believe you're up next.
Hi, everybody. Thanks. That was really helpful, Wendy. And the conversation is kind of going in the direction of what I wanted to say. It occurs to me, and knowing that the average length of stay in a jail is 20 days, and we're here to figure out what kind of a jail facility and what services are reasonable to put into the jail. Obviously, we're looking a little bit prior to incarceration and post, but the reality is that the antisocial criminogenic piece of what people are walking in with is so deeply rooted and so long-term that thinking that there's any way that that's going to be effectively addressed within a 20-day jail stay? Yeah, not so much. It seems like, you know, if somebody is clearly diagnosed with a mental illness, they're psychotic, or they've got, you know, serious depression or other things that can be effectively addressed, at least with medication, that's reasonable to think about how to do that, and perhaps some supportive psychotherapy so that they can carry on with whatever treatment they need afterwards. But thinking that antisocial stuff is going to be tackled in any way in that length of a jail stay, not realistic. What I was thinking about in the beginning of your presentation is that you've got a huge population of people that are drug involved, drug and alcohol involved. And in some ways, focusing on ensuring that you've got the qualified staff to engage those people effectively and get them started on a path. I think I was reading the minutes from the last meeting, which I was sorry I missed. David Goldman had said something about, you know, he finds that people don't get engaged in whatever services are available until the right approach is used, until you can be effective at bonding with them in some way, et cetera, because they come in resistant or in denial. That focusing on that and starting to make an impact on drug use. And if you're thinking about kind of the big picture and long story of reducing jail, criminal behavior, basically, that would be perhaps a more fruitful focus for whatever services are developed for the jail.
And that is one of the reasons the MOUD program has grown so quickly.
Yeah.
Part of the issue we run in, though, is a huge percentage of our folks come in and they definitely show opioid-based drugs, but they're also using methamphetamine. And at this point, we don't have a real good substitution or a medication that will help with that. But certainly 450 some offenders getting started on medication-assisted opioid use disorder treatment is a good step. So.
Wendy, we could spend all day with you, and I know we have 2 more questions. I do want to save enough time for our prosecutor. Can we do a quick Perry and Heather?
Absolutely, and I just wanted to use Erica's term to double down on something that you said, Wendy, that really struck me from my past experience as a substance use disorder professional and mental health professional, where you said that we really need to be viewing the involvement in the jail as a point of engagement, not just incarceration. And I have found in doing that work that oftentimes a different awareness occurs for an individual when they are facing those kinds of challenges. In addition, commonly within the jail, they are also substance free for a period of time, and there's a greater clarity. So those are a couple of factors, and really agree with what Harriet had said, and appreciate your input, Wendy.
Thank you.
Heather?
Thank you. I appreciate that perspective too, as the jail is an opportunity for a point of engagement. I also think, though, that thinking of that kind of spectrum of what's the community-based service, because just the nature of being incarcerated can be a risk factor for many other things. And Wendy, I appreciated seeing the team you have in the jail, and it looked like you do have a re-entry specialist, a FTE. I'd love for us to think about how to increase those resources. I imagine those are strapped too, and there's such an opportunity, even if it's a 20-day or less length of stay, that re-entry is so critical. And what are the referral opportunities out, and the support to help that person rehabilitate and become productive. And the last thing I'll say is, as much as we can invest on the front end to really understand the data of who's in the jail and why, I think those are really wise investments when we're talking about building 120 million plus, and we're going to ask the community to invest in that. Like, it's worth it, even if it's $1 million to understand what do we need. That's still a good investment. And with that, I have gone through, as you know, I've gone through kind of my cursory analysis of who has been using the jail, what are the top charges. And I recognize there are issues with the data, but what I see is a lot of bookings being DUIs and DV related, and like a lion's share. And so it makes me question, what are the community programs to support DV offenders and DUIs? And I don't know of very many, if any at all. And so when we're talking about needing a new facility, because there will always be people who have criminogenic factors and that, you know, need to be separate from society for some time for whatever reasons. But also, what are the programs in the community that could reduce incarceration? I think it's both. So thank you.
The only one thing I'd ask you also to look at is that you're looking at charges, which is very good. But one of the other things is those charges are frequently paired. One of the cases I was discussing with someone over the phone, and they were asking me about a particular person and why they were in custody for the DUI. And I said, no, they've resolved the issue about the DUI. The reason they're still in custody is because they've been charged with first-degree murder. So what happens is the data set that you're looking at picks up all the charges and it doesn't necessarily correlate them. So what we'll find is that somebody will get picked up for what is a very serious crime, but then there's going to be another 5 or 6 other charges that also get resolved. We're still trying to figure out how we can parse that out and still follow the state law. But you are right in that the data is very confusing, and unless you're used to looking at it, it doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. So I absolutely agree with you on that. Having a statistician who's comfortable with the criminal justice system would help a lot. But at this point, right now, I just need enough deputies so that we can keep people safe while they're in custody. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope I haven't used up everybody's time, but if anybody has any other specific questions, let me know. And in the meantime, I will work on getting the information that I've been asked for and get it out. Hopefully within a week, but I'm going to be gone part of next week. My niece is getting married, so I'll be off work for a couple of days, but I should be able to pull a lot of it together for you.
Thank you again, Chief Jones, for your time and for all the information. Very much appreciated. All right. Next up, I believe Dan is already introduced, but we have Ryan Anderson, who's the Assistant City Attorney for the City of Bellingham. Ryan, take it away, please.
All right, thanks, Mike. I slotted me for 20 minutes and Chief Jones for only 15, but clearly that should have been easily reversed. You could take the whole hour with Chief Jones, my goodness, for good reason. I won't bore you with a bunch of details. I'll just kind of give you a quick overview. So I've been in this position, worked for the City of Bellingham for over 16 years, always in this office, a couple of stints at City Hall, but I've done this job quite a long time, and I've seen a lot of things that have changed in our community and our jail and the way we sort of address crime during that period. So yeah. So one of the things that I look at when I look at what we do here in the City of Bellingham is dealing with misdemeanors. Is first category I like to call it is that we deal with a lot of quality of life crimes, right? Like, and what I mean by that, and I say this often, which is, you know, it's a lot of the things that you don't see in other certainly not in the county, or maybe not even in the county's misdemeanor system in district court, but it's shoplifting, it's theft, it's trespass, it's, you know, urinating, defecating in public downtown, it's, you know, disorderly conduct, fighting, you know, it's everything related to that, right? Those sort of behaviors that in a lot of ways, every time somebody wants to ask me or tell me, you know, what's going wrong with the city or what's going wrong with our community and criminals, it's usually those crimes that they're pointing to, right? Like that's because that's what people see. You know, most people don't have much experience with serious felonies, which is great, good. I'm glad they don't. But what they do see on a daily basis, you know, are the things that I end up dealing with, right? They see people stealing, people fighting, people using the sidewalks and vestibules as bathrooms, you know, that kind of stuff, right? So, and that's why, again, I like to call that the quality of life crimes, because that's the gauge for a lot of people, whether they think the community is moving in the right or wrong direction. And that is a good bulk of, we've kept statistics since I've been here, and obviously the COVID years are a little bit different from what we filed and didn't file, but on average, we're about 2,600 cases a year is what we get in the city of Bellingham. We have 3 prosecutors assigned to that entire caseload. That does not include infractions or anything like that. That's just criminal cases. The other subset, though, of the cases that we do have, and I think it's important to recognize that we do have, is kind of what was just talked about there, which was the DUIs and domestic violence cases, right? Those are kind of in our misdemeanor world, those are our most serious. They can range from the few stalking cases that we have pending right now, multiple violators, you know, of no contact orders, DUIs, you know, usually it's, you know, people with, we get most of our offenders, thankfully, are first-time offenders, but we do have quite a number of people who are on their 2nd, 3rd. Today I had 2 with their 5th and 6th DUIs. So those are like the more serious nature of what we deal with right out of misdemeanor court. And so the idea is, you know, kind of that I was asked, I think, to talk about is how does that, over the time that I've been here, how does that relate to bookings in the jail? What do we do? And sort of what are the challenges that we have? And what I want to say is that, you know, the overwhelming majority of people that we have that are interacting in Bellingham Municipal Court are cited by summons or cited and released in the field. That means they're not booked. They're not going to be booked into jail. Almer can tell you all the probably real statistics about this, but that's the overwhelming majority of people. Is they interact, there's a crime that's committed, officers arrive, and even if it was technically a bookable offense, then they don't. The officer gives them a shot, you know, to appear in court out of custody, right? And that is by far and away how we interact and have for my entire 16 plus years that I've been here. The bookings primarily are made up of about 3 categories for us. One are the mandatory bookings. So that would be your DUIs and domestic violence cases, right? So those are the ones where usually by statute, by law, the officers are obligated to mandatory arrest and book, or, you know, because of the serious nature of the offense. If it's a domestic violence assault, you know, then of course they have to make that call and book, is usually what happens. Number 2, that category besides mandatory bookings is warrants. So if there was, and this is back to the old days, this doesn't really happen right now with the restrictions in place, is, you know, if someone didn't appear for their out of custody court hearings, didn't appear to serve their jail time, didn't appear for their probation, you know, reviews, then they get a warrant for their arrest because they're not appearing for court. They're not participating in the process out of custody. And so they might have their warrant eventually served on them if they were contacted by law enforcement later. Generally, those warrants are served really just by incidental contact, right? Maybe they commit another crime, maybe they were a victim of another crime, a witness, or they just used to be a lot of times you could just sort of see some of the usual players maybe downtown, and you would, officers would check and see, oh, they've got 5 or 6 warrants for their arrest. Right now with booking restrictions, that category is pretty much not being booked at all. In the more sort of rare situation, it did happen, you know, I mean, I could speculate once a week, maybe a little bit more, would be sort of the person who maybe hasn't committed the serious incident, but is just essentially terrorizing businesses and victims around downtown, and is generating just vast amounts of calls, right? So officers have responded 3, 4, 5, maybe a dozen times, even more. And it's constant, you know, it's an assault, it's a discon, it's a trespass, they're refusing to leave this business. Now they're fighting people out front of the Horseshoe. Now they're doing this. There used to come a point where law enforcement, particularly at night, would just go, okay, we've got all these other crimes and other situations we got to deal with. And this person, the town just needs a break from this person right now, like, because they're terrorizing people. And so that would be sort of the rare case where maybe somebody would get booked on, you know, a couple of non-domestic violence assaults or a few disorderly conducts or something of that nature. So those are kind of the 3 categories historically, how people made it into jail for us. The idea that someone got caught shoplifting alcohol from Rite Aid and immediately got booked into jail on that shoplifting is not true. That doesn't happen. Those would be in the cite and release or the cite by summons category. So that's always historically been the case since I've been here. But those, so as I said, the bookings have always sort of been in those three categories. Right now with booking restrictions, essentially it's really just the mandatory bookings that are getting in, and that's a very low number for us. And as Chief Jones could tell you, like based on restrictions, those people are in and out pretty quickly and not really staying there very much right now for us. One of the third categories of dealing with things that we created a number of years ago was electronical monitoring and a GPS system, which we brought to the county, which was not being utilized by anybody when we first started it. And Peter Raffato and I came up with this idea just really because there were some jail issues a number of years ago, and there were some issues of us, excuse me, what we were going to do, you know, with inmates and people who needed to serve time. So we came up with this Friendship Diversion Services. We looked them up and had a meeting and decided that this was a good option for us. It has worked out really, really well. And essentially what that is for the home monitoring portion of it, it's a bracelet and it's GPS, right? So it's pull up a screen just like Google Earth and you can see where the individual is at. The provider that we use essentially puts sort of dots where their person is supposed to be between certain hours, and that person has to be within that dot. And then they do allow them to go to work. You make medical appointments, you know, probation appointments, things like that. So, and they get day for day credit for that every day. So at first, I'll be honest with you, it was a little, you know, it's a number of years now we've done it, a little skeptical about some of it as a form of, you know, when you're looking at jail time as a form of punishment, but it has actually worked pretty well. There's been some incidents, but or maybe it's not the greatest fit, but overall, it's been a really successful program for us. The vast majority of time served on EHM for us is done post-conviction. That means that the person was out of custody, they maintained, you know, they were out of custody through the pendency of their case, they met with their attorney, whatever, and eventually they pled guilty or, you know, had a trial and were found guilty, and then they received a sentence from the court. Perhaps they failed on their probation, which often happens, and then they got revoked from their probation and have to serve a sentence from the court. So the vast majority of people that we serve, that we have on our electronic home detention bracelet are serving post-conviction. So they've been found guilty or pled guilty and are serving their time on that. And that's been quite successful. We do have a few people, we had one entered this morning, but it's much rarer for them to be doing that pre-trial. It's just a number of reasons why. So that would be somebody that in lieu of maybe bail, and certainly in lieu of going into the Whatcom County Jail, we place them on home detention, and essentially they're tracked as an in custody but pending case. Again, there's a variety of reasons why that isn't always a good fit. They have to sort of qualify. Some people, they're just not, it just isn't a great fit for them. In a lot of ways too, for me, just asking for certain release conditions, I look at, well, if alcohol is an issue, then maybe instead of asking for bail and home detention, maybe we'll do, you know, we have another bracelet called the Scram device, which monitors alcohol, or maybe we'll hook them up with probation services, you know, while we're pending. And so sometimes it's just sort of a cost benefit, right? It's like, you know, instead of home detentioning them, let's use these other tools we have. So it's just kind of the way it works out. But the vast majority of EHM that we have are really on post-conviction. So, you know, that's kind of just a quick shot of what we deal with and how we utilize the jail. The people that are currently mostly in the jail for us in Whatcom County Jail are there because they're not just there on our charges. They're all there on mostly other felony charges. We rarely have people right now in the last few years that have been there just on Bellingham charges. There may be a couple at the work center right now just because the charges are serious enough that it warrants that. And I appreciate the jail not just booting them out into the public, but right now, it's very hard for us to actually have people, even if they sort of deserve to have some tighter conditions on their release, to really have that. And it factors in the way that we're presenting their cases in the court, to be honest with you too, and how we're making our recommendations, because we know that there's just not much, we can do if they don't comply. So one of our biggest issues, and I would say, you know, I don't know, I can't give you all numbers, and it would take I wouldn't want to guess, you know, what the city needs or what our capacity looks like, you know, and I'm certain that other prosecutors' office and probably even defense attorneys would tell you this. One of the issues that we're facing currently with a lot of the issues with the jail, and I say all this obviously with a complete understanding that this is not Chief Jones's fault or anything. It's just what we're all dealing with because of those issues that exist, is just non-compliance, right? So today I just took the numbers from this morning's calendar just to give you a good idea of what we're dealing with. We had 30 people on the out of custody arraignment calendar this morning, 30 different individuals who were cited with crimes that were told to appear, that received their tickets and were told to appear. And today was actually a very good day of the number of people that showed up, but it was only 9 out of 30. And that was actually really good from what we've had for the last couple of years. Only 9 of 30 people showed up. A few of the people who didn't show up was one individual who was in jail, was released. He had a TR for a bit on a medical issue. He was placed on bracelets. He cut that off today. He told FDS that he would drink and he would do what he wants. This is his 6th DUI in his lifetime. And he decided not to appear for court today. But I don't know what the recourse is for that, because at this point, if he's not going to comply with home detention, he will not comply with not consuming alcohol on bracelets. If there's no space at the jail, that's it. There's nothing we can do until hopefully he doesn't hurt himself or hurt someone else, which is very likely what will happen. But that was this morning. He didn't make it to court. I had a person who didn't make it to court today on an assault of a DSHS employee. He has 17 prior convictions for assault. He didn't make it to court today. He won't go to jail. The warrant won't be served most likely, because that's just not as serious a case as what the standards are allowing for people to get into custody right now. And I don't say this to be like, let's pull out the most dramatic cases. This is just literally what I had on this morning. Another individual with 11 active warrants for theft cases. It's a lot of what we have right now are a lot of theft cases. And I think people just know that they're not going to get booked on it. So they just don't appear. They don't participate. And that's probably the most frustrating part of what we do. And I know there's definitely, we can create amazing, and I've always been very supportive, of our programs and LEAD and GRACE and everything else that we can do. And those are awesome. Mental health courts, fantastic. But it always requires a certain level of participation from the offender. And what we have right now, particularly out of custody, is a lack of participation, and people know it. And so if we have individuals cutting their bracelets off, which is not an anomaly for us right now, people don't want to show up to probation, don't want to stop drinking, don't want to appear for their theft cases, don't care to, 11, 10, warrants on cases because they know that they don't have to. So it's non-participation is probably the most frustrating thing, right? There's a lot of tools that we have out there, and we can create a lot of tools. But the unfortunate thing for us is that we just have a real issue with that participation and showing up to court. So we're getting very low turnout for our out of custody arraignment calendars. Even if those cases go to warrants, those warrants are not really being served. And it's just kind of a pile up and a pile up for us. It's very frustrating, I'll be honest with you. And that's just sort of the current state of affairs. We've always had the situation where we get warrants and people don't appear, but that's just kind of where we're at. And I don't have the answers to all these things. What I will always tell people is we've gotten this situation through a variety of factors, and we will not dig ourselves out of this situation without a variety of solutions, right? There is no, oh, well, if we only had, a jail with 500 beds, right? Well, clearly that's not the answer, right? So it's not, again, we've gotten here a variety of ways, and we have to get out of it in a variety of ways that are creative and thoughtful. But from a challenging perspective, at least currently, that's what we're dealing with. I don't know if that's helpful at all for everybody, but that's what I got.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and you covered an amazing amount of material in a short time, and that was incredible. So for me, that was incredible. I'm going to step back and start calling on people. I see Mr. Lilliquist has a question, and if folks are okay to stay a little bit, we certainly understand we are very near time. So our apologies for if we're having it run. There's just too much content for an hour, so apologies in advance. If you can stay, please do. And I believe, Kathy, we can keep this venue open. Is that correct, Kathy Halka? We can keep it open.
Yes, we can. And for those of you who may have to leave early, the recording will be posted online. I'm sorry, for those of you who have to leave on time.
Okay. And if anybody does, please shout out and let us know. I'm going to call on Michael, but if you have to leave and got a burning question, we want to get you first. So Michael, please go.
Ryan, I'm wondering if you're dealing with different people than are in jail. I know technically they're different people, but Wendy was talking about 45% of her population having a serious mental illness. She was talking about some proportion of them having enduring cognitive disadvantages and disabilities or dysfunctions, and some of them having medical conditions. Are your people the same? Are your people also like that? Well, what I'm kind of maybe imagining is that there are some people who are caught in the dragnet, end up being booked and stay in Wendy's system. And there are other people different in their proportions of those categories who are in your world, the cycle and release people. I'm going to guess that they're probably a different set of people, but what do you think?
Yeah, I think that definitely, I think that group that Wendy discussed definitely makes up a percentage of what I deal with, you know, particularly out of custody, but probably ends up being that mental illness isn't 45%, right? It's still there, but it's a lower percentage of the people that we have, right? And some of them still commit crimes across the spectrum. So I would say yes, because it's just a bigger pool of candidates, right, that you're pulling from too, right? So it's everybody. So while it still exists and those factors all definitely exist in the population I'm dealing with, you're also correct in saying that I would say that there's also, because that pool is bigger, it's diluted, right? Definitely it's not 45% of the people that I'm dealing with at these hearings or not showing up. It's not mental illness, right? There is a percentage of that for sure, but it's definitely not as big as it is as what you're seeing in the jail.
All right, I'm looking and hopefully I'm not missing anybody, but are there other questions out there? I'm happy to take them. We've still got Ryan here. Brel, please go ahead.
So much. I'm going to sound pretty ignorant, but I just realized I don't know this. So you've been focusing on misdemeanors. Does your prosecutor office handle the trials of felonies, or is that a different prosecutor office?
Yeah, no, it's a good question real quick. So yeah, so the city of Bellingham, just like the city of Ferndale, city of Linden, whereas Blaine, you know, all those Sumas, we just deal with the misdemeanors in this jurisdiction of that city, right?
Gotcha.
So every felony and all misdemeanors that occur in sort of county, non-city areas all go to the Whatcom County Prosecuting Attorney's Office, and they're all handled there. So,
oh, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
And just one more follow-up question. So just, yeah, really interesting to find out about like just the majority of these things often being these quality of life type crimes that you mentioned. And I'm just wondering, like, beyond sort of the ability to put people, like, you know, the power to put people in jail has been lowered because of these restrictions, it seems like. But like, I'm wondering if your office or if you have any opinions about like what kind of programming or things in the community, I mean, just anecdotally, even from your perspective, like would reduce some of the numbers of these crimes. Like what's the root cause of these quality of life issues, like trespassing, urinating in public, et cetera, and like what would get to the root cause of there not being so many of these?
That's such that probably would require like a thesis paper to write. That's a great question. I'm not trying to discount the question. It's a great question, but so many things. All I can really say is, like I said, it's so many things have gotten us here, and it's going to take a lot of things to get us out. There are some, I'm sure there's plenty, all ideas, right? It's going to take definitely engagement. It's going to take, you know, not just booking into jail. It's going to take having services for mental health, for alcohol, but it is going to also take extra jail space, and it's going to take extra, you know, law enforcement. It's going to take all of those things. I don't know that. I mean, I could certainly sit down with somebody and have a discussion about what that looks like specifically, but I think it's. I don't know that there's like a match. I mean, I would say this. Generally, I think some of it is attitudinal in the sense that if you know that there aren't going to be booked, and you know there's not enough police out on the streets to respond to those offenses, then it becomes not an issue for you to continue to commit those offenses, whether it be shoplifting, trespass, whatever, right? And so they sort of go unabated. And I think, Don, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but that sort of cycles in on itself, right? So there's no like, oh man, if we only just stop this, that would stop it. It's just sort of a like, I'm not saying that booking jail has to happen to everybody, but there is a sort of cycle of like, well, if you had all these tools and you had all these resources, the information gets spread out to that community, and they start to go, oh, there actually are consequences to continuing to do some of this. Oh, this did actually happen. Oh, they did clean up this area. Oh, they did make us move. Oh, I did get caught for shoplifting, and I've now they're actually taking me to court on it. You know, all of that sort of, we've gotten here because a lot of it is, oh, there's really no consequence to that. And that's evidenced out by the massive cases I have that are just repeat offenders over and over and over, going to warrants and knowing that nothing, even when they're contacted by law enforcement, nothing will change other than here's your ticket. Well, hopefully it'll show up to court one day. So I don't have the answer better than that, other than it's, you know, that it's a feeling, right, amongst people in that sort of, that there's no consequence to this at this point. And I don't mean consequence like I'm, you know, going to jail just necessarily, by the way. I know that there are many other things, but there just isn't, right? So law enforcement are going to talk to me. Nobody's here. There's not enough police on the streets. The jail isn't going to book. That word gets spread. We know that. It gets out there, and then it just becomes a like, okay, well, they know they're not going to deal with me, so I'll just continue to do what I'm doing. And so how do you answer that, right? And that's a tough one. So,
Cliff, I believe you're up next.
I think he kind of answered some of what I was thinking, but to me, the big issue is that because there's no facility, there's no consequences to what these people are doing, and just emboldens them to be able to do more. And not that some of the programs wouldn't help, but I think that they always need to realize that there's going to be some consequence that they're going to have to pay. And yeah, I think that I just want to advocate that we need to work on a facility that's going to be big enough to handle all these things. And the programs can be supplemental, but I just want to advocate that, again, we need to get moving on a facility. We've been doing this since 1996 was when they first realized that the facility that we have currently is inadequate. And then it's unsafe, it's not, yeah, I just, but anyway, the consequences, having some way to make consequences for people's bad behavior needs to be in the picture. And I appreciate what Ryan had to say. I don't know, maybe he can comment some more.
yeah, thanks, Cliff. And in addition to that, like I said, too, it's not, the consequences can be many things, also not just including up to and including jail, but, you know, even just law enforcement contact at the scene. One of the biggest complaints that I've heard, Eric Rich and I've gone to meet with some of the business owners who talk about loss prevention and the thousands of dollars they're losing every hour even in our city due to theft, is that, like, you know, by the time they call law enforcement, you know, because of staffing issues and other things, just aren't responding, right? So, or getting there in time to make that contact with the offender, which, if that's what we're talking about, engagement, like, and I 100% agree with Chief Jones on that too, that engagement can even start in the field, right? It doesn't have to necessarily involve a booking, but it could be an arrest, a contact with law enforcement, being able to make it to the store to make that arrest for that theft or shoplift. And then that can lead to, you know, either, you know, obviously a path to jail, or, you know, here's a connection to lead services, here's a connection to some other programs that we have. So the consequences can be a lot of things, but sometimes it's even just being stopped by law enforcement and being like, hey, we know you're doing this, you're going to be cited for a crime. And then again, there could be that handoff or that lead into whatever the programmatic thing, but we're not. And again, this isn't a dig on anybody or on BPD at all, but like with staffing issues, they're just not even making that sort of consequential contact, right? Just because of staffing. And Don, again, tell me if I'm wrong on that, but I think that's a frustration that exists among businesses. That, I mean, I hear it all the time. We call and no one's there, and the guy just drives away with $5,000 worth of coats. And you're like, yeah, oh, okay. And that's what I mean, no consequence, right? So.
Ryan, thank you for that. Kendra, I believe you're up next, and then Heather.
Yeah, thank you. Ryan, this question is for you. Is mental health court still ongoing? And if so, what are the results?
Yeah, it is. We've got I think our membership's up now a little bit. It was a little tough during COVID. It's always been a tricky one to get membership at the misdemeanor level, to be totally honest with you. You know, in a lot of ways, and I don't disagree with this. First of all, you have to be a right fit, right? It's not just mentally ill, right? I think there's a lot of people that saw it as a magic, you know, this silver bullet, like, oh, this will be all the mentally ill people if we create mental health court. There's a lot of requirements, and through that screening process that we have, you have to be the right sort of mental illness is the expert way I'll say it, right? Because you have to be the right fit for that type of program, right? There's some people who have different behavioral characteristics or different mental health characteristics that just don't, you know, make them a good fit for a group setting, right? There's worry about preying on other people or all these sorts of other issues that were brought up. And I was like, well, I didn't know that. So that's number one. Number two is your consequence. A lot of times they look and they go, I don't know that, and I understand this perfectly from if I was their attorney advising them as well, which is you can sign up for a 1.5 year long program and maybe get your case dismissed at the end, hopefully. Or you can take this, you know, whatever the plea is, because it's a second or third offense. And so you're only looking at a few days of home detention and then you're done, right? And so while we'd rather deal with the bigger issue at hand, you know, and maybe have them in that treatment program and that program for mental health court, a lot of people opt to just resolve their case and take what essentially is their sentence, because the sentence isn't that big, instead of engaging in mental health court. So we've tried to work with that over the years, and tried to find a balance for that, but that has been a struggle. And again, I don't fault defense attorneys for advising their clients to plead instead of taking that. I understand when that unique situation comes up, but that's been a struggle for us, is to get participants. Once they're in, it's been fantastic, right? So once they're in, it's been really, really good. It's just sort of finding that participation level, but it's been very, very successful. And the other thing is, again, defining, last thing I'll say real quick, it's defining success differently, right? Success in a mental health program is not this person will never commit crimes again, right? And I think that's what we have to realize too, is, you know, everybody throws out recidivism, and that's fantastic. We've had people that when they were in the program, few bumps, otherwise did really great. Once they're out of the program, you know, we have one individual, I think he's on his 3rd time back in the program. That doesn't mean he's a failure, right? He's succeeding in the program now. So, you know, it's just redefining success maybe a little bit differently than, well, they never committed a crime again. Yeah, that's not maybe realistic. And that's not necessarily what success is for some of our participants. But generally, I would say very successful.
Heather.
A couple of things I'd like to offer. I think Brel's question about what are the root causes is actually really worthy of us thinking about. And all the paths that I've taken on answering that is that it actually is investments before the age of 5. Like, it starts that young, and we can actually, as a community, make those investments, and they're a lot cheaper than making these giant investments in interventions and treatment. And Cliff, in response to your comment too about the facility and no space being not a deterrent enough, people don't think they're going to get punished, and so they just continue to commit crimes. What I'd like to offer though is that even before COVID, without booking restrictions, our recidivism rates are, you know, 60% or more. I haven't seen any different numbers. To me, that says that even when the facility is the punishment or the consequence, spending time in jail, it still is not working for 2/3 of our people. They get out and they recommit crimes. And so I think there's still opportunity. I'm not saying we don't need a new facility. I think we definitely do. But there was also this community training that I saw some of you at, the Community's Guide to Homelessness, Ryan Dowd. For some individuals, and I would imagine many actually that are in our criminal justice system, they're immune to punishment. And they're not thinking, okay, so now this crime, I'm gonna get 5 months instead of 2. That doesn't factor into their decision-making. And for those quality of life crimes, I just don't think that it just doesn't matter whether it's 20 days or 6 months. And the laws are that we can't just hold people indefinitely for quality of life crimes. You can't put somebody in jail for life because they steal from the grocery store. I don't think that's how the law is written. So I just want to offer those reflections back to this group.
Thank you for those, Heather. Are there any other questions? I did a brief scan. I want to make sure that I didn't miss anybody. Again, thank you to our presenter and everybody for who's been able to stay late. But I do want to be really respectful of people's time. So if you did have another question, why don't you go ahead and pop off and ask it. And if not, if you think of things throughout, I believe they can get a hold of somebody in SAC. I think that's right. Isn't that right, Heather? People have follow-up questions, we can always kind of facilitate an answer for any of that. And I would just, Brel, did you have another question?
Well, I was just sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just wondering if, like, really, I just so appreciate these presentations. They've been so informative, and I'm wondering if we could ever get one, if there's time enough to get one, maybe from the public defender's office as well. Since it seems like we're kind of getting these different arenas of the justice system, or rather legal system. Is that possible, or is, I don't know, is that something?
Well, just so I can make sure that I heard you correctly, you're saying from the defender's office?
Yeah.
I don't know if Maya's still with us.
I'm here, and I guess I'm happy to talk, but I'm not, I guess I'd want to know what you would want us to present about.
Well, I mean, there's been times throughout some of these meetings where I feel like you have added some really insightful things of maybe some programs that you thought, would be helpful, but in a similar way of like how some of these other entities are sharing about sort of the types of folks that they're seeing and sort of their perspective on what kind of programming things would be useful. And maybe you already have shared that, so maybe it's not really necessary for a full thing, but just to get a picture of your take on the legal system and what kinds of programs would be helpful within this context of the work that we're doing.
All right, Burrell, thank you for that question and comment. And I do see Barry popping in. I want to go ahead and go to Barry real quick.
I think that's something, Burrell, that's a good idea. And I think that's something we should take up in our planning group and talk about because we're kind of the ones that are trying to put all these things together and get this information out to you. So the comment is very much appreciated.
Well, with that, I believe we are well over time. And again, thanks to our presenters, thanks to all the questions, because I think that really helps kind of glean more out value-wise. And I'm always impressed by this group and the questions that come out. It's just outstanding. Kathy?
I don't know if you can hear me all right.
Oh, I
you hear
can.
me
I couldn't
okay?
before. We can hear you fine now.
Sorry about that. I just wanted to let everyone know that if you have questions for any of the presenters, you can email me at sac@co.whatcom.wa.us, and I'd be happy to get those answers from any of the speakers and share them with the whole SAC. Thank you.
And Kathy, since I don't do these mostly, when we're normally in a committee meeting, we always go to public comment. I do see that we have a couple attendees. Are we doing public comment in this forum as well?
That isn't included in our agenda today, and I believe the 2 attendees are staff members.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, with that, thank you again all for your time. And I believe that we are then adjourned.